And for the witnesses, we have a series of 5 votes beginning approximately 10:30. We will work through the votes, but there'll be people coming and going. Don't be alarmed. We have to do the votes. I just want to give everyone a heads up. The committee meets today for the 4th in a series of committee engagements that seek to assess the United States military's 20-year mission in Afghanistan, understand factors that led to the Taliban's rapid takeover of the country and the collapse of the Afghan government and the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. We also are interested in overseeing DoD operations in support of Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Holders, or SIVs, and other high-risk Afghans, and explore the lessons learned for counterterrorism operations going forward while framing these operations within broader national security priorities and emerging threats. Today's hearing will explore perspectives from 2 expert witnesses. Joining us today are Dr. Vali Nasser, Professor of Middle East Studies and International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and former Senior Advisor to the United States Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Mr. Thomas Jocelyn, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and Senior Editor of the Long War Journal. And I'd like to thank you both for joining us today. Thank you very much. Recent attention has been focused on the final months in Afghanistan. I think it is equally important, however, that this committee examines the broader 2-decade mission that shaped the outcome we face today. The path that led to this moment was paved with years of mistakes spanning 4 presidencies. There is plenty of blame to go around. This hearing is not just a review for history's sake. There is a temptation to close the book on Afghanistan and move on to longer-term strategic competition with China and Russia. However, while the threat from violent extremists has changed, we must ensure we remain partial to carry out counterterrorism operations in an effective manner. In order to move forward, we must capture the lessons of the last 2 decades. On Tuesday, we heard from Secretary of Defense Austin, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, and Commander of U.S. Central Command, General McKenzie, regarding their views on what contributed to the outcome we now face in Afghanistan. Notably, we heard from Generals Milley and McKenzie that while their military advice was to keep 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, they acknowledged that this plan created the real possibilities of more U.S. casualties and a likely return to war with the Taliban. President Biden concluded that more troops might buy more time and casualties, but more time would not create a more effective Afghan government. General Milley pointed out several strategic decisions that contributed to the outcome in Afghanistan, which included the invasion of Iraq, Pakistan's support to the Taliban, and the corruption of the Afghan government, and U.S. mission creep into counterinsurgency and nation-building. And I agree with General Milley that these are important factors to grapple with. I also think the implications of the Doha agreement, which required the withdrawal of all U.S. and coalition forces and international contractors, warrant further analysis. General Milley also testified that he was committed to understanding, quote, how we developed, trained, and equipped the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces and why they collapsed in 11 days. It is paramount to understand and learn from this failure as we continue overseas operations where we must work by, with, and through partner nations to achieve shared national security goals. Despite colossal efforts over multiple administrations, both Democratic and Republican, we were unable to help build an Afghan government capable of leading its people, nor an Afghan security force capable of defeating the Taliban. Afghan soldiers fought bravely in the face of massive casualties, but faced with the loss of American military support and hamstrung by corruption within, they were unable to stand on their own against Taliban forces. As the committee continues its review and oversight of the war in Afghanistan, I would ask that during today's hearing you provide your assessments of the mission. We would like to understand what events and decisions throughout the war you believe have shaped the ultimate outcome, and what lessons we can apply to future operations. We would also like to hear your thoughts on how to effectively transition to an over-the-horizon counterterrorism architecture. In addition, we would like your impressions on the regional dynamics following the withdrawal of our forces, including the implications for relations with Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, and others, and your recommendations for optimizing regional security arrangements going forward. With that, let me recognize Ranking Member Inhofe for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witness for being here today. We learned a lot about in our hearing on Tuesday about how President Biden completely mismanaged the withdrawal from Afghanistan from the start to the finish, and I hope that's just the beginning of our oversight as to what happened. Today I want to hear more from our experts about what comes next. We haven't received any detail yet on that from the administration, but I hope they create a better plan than they had for the drawdown. We did hear one message very clearly on Tuesday. As a result of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, the threat of radical Islamist terrorism is increasing, even as our capabilities to combat terrorism are decreasing. General McKenzie told us, and this is a quote, he said, "We're not confident that we can prevent Afghanistan from being used as a launching pad from terrorism right now." That's quite a statement. That's quite a reality. Our generals have repeatedly told us just how hard it is to find and track terrorists without partners on the ground. Our intelligence capabilities are also drastically reduced, and these are understatements. We will discuss that today and take a closer look at the threat that Al-Qaeda, the Ghani network, and ISIS pose from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. President Biden has completely dismissed this threat. He said Al-Qaeda is gone from Afghanistan. We heard on Tuesday that that's just not right. We're going to examine that threat more closely today. Here's just one example. The Biden administration claims that the core Al-Qaeda threats are in Yemen, Somalia, and West Africa. But the leaders of those organizations came from Afghanistan's training camps, and those training camps will fully resume operations under Taliban rule. I have no doubt about that. I'm afraid that over 20 years of successfully preventing an attack from Afghanistan, many have forgotten the scale and scope of the threat. The withdrawal from Afghanistan has made our counterterrorism job much, much harder. We've got to figure out how to get it right and to protect the Americans. That's what this is all about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. And now let me recognize Dr. Nasser. It's still not on, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Reid, Ranking Member Inhofe, and members of the committee for providing me with this opportunity to testify before you today. I would like to focus my comments on the longer-term issues of why did an insurgency emerge in Afghanistan after the toppling of the Taliban in 2001, why did it gain steam, and ultimately why did it win in the manner that it did. Now, I think there's a number of key factors we have to look at. They're not exhaustive of all the explanations for why things happened the way they did, but it's important to keep them in mind. First, it's the United States won in Afghanistan, toppling the Taliban in 2001 quickly and decisively. But it did not follow that victory with the reintegration of the Taliban rank-and-file soldiers into Afghanistan's economy and society and the new Afghanistan that it was standing up. And as we saw also in Iraq later on, this led to an disenfranchisement of not just the Taliban soldiers, their supporters, but also conflated that disenfranchisement with Pashtun grievances that began to surface very quickly against a Northern Alliance-led government that was backed by the United States. And that was really sowed the seeds of the insurgency. Secondly, the United States assumed that Pakistan's support for destroying Al-Qaeda, as it was being promoted by its president then, Pervez Musharraf, also extended to Pakistan's that Pakistan would also support the state that the United States was building in Afghanistan. This was not true. Pakistan supported destruction of al-Qaeda, but Pakistan viewed the kind of state that the United States was setting up in Afghanistan as a natural ally of India. In fact, they would point out that President Karzai had close ties to India, and they saw Afghanistan under a secular government as a threat to their territorial integrity by fomenting Pashtun separatism. It is important to note that neither Pakistan nor the defeated Taliban were represented at the Bonn conference that set up the new state in Afghanistan, and therefore had no vested interest in its success and actually put their shoulders to undoing it. And the combination of the two proved to be a very difficult threat for the United States to overcome. Throughout the past 20 years, the United States did not manage to either persuade or pressure Pakistan to change course, largely because our project in Afghanistan was at fundamental odds with how Pakistan saw its national security. Thirdly, we went to Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda and to punish and remove the Taliban from power. And that mission was accomplished very quickly. But then there was a shift in strategy towards building a modern democratic state in a country that had been ravaged by civil war over the decades, lacked the rudiments of institutions of government, and was deeply divided by regional divisions, ethnic divisions, and tribal divisions. And this actually was not a military mission anymore. This state-building mission complicated and confounded the military mission. Most of the mistakes in Afghanistan, most of the problems we face, such as corruption, misgovernment, misrule, alienation of the population, had to do with the state building, not with the military mission. And in addition to that, as a fourth factor, we very quickly tried to replicate the military success in Afghanistan by going to Iraq. And the outcome of that war not only took our eyes off of Afghanistan, providing a critical time period for the Taliban to build a base, but actually convinced the Taliban and their supporters and other regional actors that we were going to fall short of both our military and state-building objectives because of what they were seeing in Iraq. And as a result, the demonstration effect of Iraq favored resistance to the United States. Fifth, I would say that once the insurgency began to gain ground, we decided to import the strategy that was working in Iraq, the counterinsurgency strategy, into Afghanistan. And for varieties of reasons, it did not prove successful. The Taliban proved to be fierce fighters. They were rooted in the majority population in the southern part of Afghanistan and did receive support. They were protected by a forbidding geography, and most importantly, they had support and a safe haven in Pakistan. We then turned our attention to the idea of standing up a resilient and large Afghan security force. Even back in 2010, 2011, when I was in the US government, there was skepticism that this would ever work. It was very expensive. We were building a military that was modeled after our own military. It was heavily dependent on sophisticated technology, ongoing US service support, and continued US command and control. It also had ethnic components to it that made its work difficult, in many cases deploying Tajik troops to Pashtun areas where they would be viewed as occupying forces themselves. And it was difficult to see how the United States was going to create a corporate identity for a military in short order, where other militaries require a good deal of time for that to happen. Finally, the Doha Agreement. I think the denouement of the war is important. We went to the Doha Agreement after we decided that the war was not winnable in 2016, after the fact that the Taliban had been gaining territory and the scale of their attacks in Kabul had increased significantly. And we went to the talks at a time when the Taliban were ascendant and were confident, and we were looking at our military strategy as an impasse. Now, the Doha agreement was not a peace treaty. It was a cessation of hostilities agreement between the two main combatant forces in Afghanistan, that is the United States and the Taliban. The Doha agreement at its core agreed to a ceasefire with the Taliban while the talks went on. It also agreed to a safe passage for the US troops out of Afghanistan, and it stipulated that the Taliban would not harbor terrorists and Al-Qaeda after the United States departed from Afghanistan. What the Doha agreement did not do, it did not insist on a future shape of government in Afghanistan. It did not insist on an inclusive government. It did not even insist off the bat on that the Taliban need to negotiate with the Afghan government. This was largely an effort that was initiated after the initial ceasefire deal was signed. And in the end, although we kept saying that the Afghan government and the Afghan military were independent, sovereign actors, but in reality, we didn't treat them as such. We didn't bring the Afghan army to the table as a combatant force in Afghanistan. We treated the Afghan army as a subsidiary of the American military effort. And we negotiated on behalf of the Afghan government. Even the Afghan government was not supportive of the Doha agreement at the beginning. And that gave the Taliban a very clear indication that the United States did not care about either the Afghan government or the Afghan military. All it cared was a ceasefire agreement that would get it out of Afghanistan. It is also important to note that the Doha agreement did not provide for a residual American force to stay in Afghanistan to do counterterrorism efforts. And finally, I would say that by January of 2021, long before actually the events of the summer happened, much of the Doha agreement had been implemented already. Particularly the troop withdrawal had gone on aggressively. And in my opinion, by the summer of 2021, we no longer had leverage on the ground to actually demand a reopening of the talks or change its terms. We had an option of either finishing it and getting out, or reneging on it altogether and basically go back to fighting. And I think that explains also the way in which everything unfolded going forward. Now, how should we look at Afghanistan now after this war is done? I think we are right to be worried about terrorism in Afghanistan. We are right to be worried about how the Taliban will govern, how inclusive they be, how they will treat women, and how they will treat more broadly human and civil rights. And also we should remain vigilant about issues such as drugs. But I would say that the worst case scenario in Afghanistan is not a Taliban government, is no government at all. That if Taliban unravels because of the economic collapse or because of political pressure, that then nobody is accountable for that territory. And that, I think, is the scenario in which we might have to go back. So I would say that it is important for the United States to remain engaged, particularly with other regional actors who share the very same fears about Afghanistan, to see how that country can be stabilized and that we avert the worst humanitarian, political, and security threats that might be forthcoming. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, please.
Well, Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify here today. I've testified more than 20 times, and unfortunately, many of those times was to discuss the impending disaster in Afghanistan, and now we're discussing the aftermath. I want to take my oral testimony to comment on a few things I heard on Tuesday, just for clarification, because as you continue to explore the war in Afghanistan and how it went this way, I think there are a few things that need to be clarified. I heard, for example, General Milley say that nobody saw that the Afghan forces and government would collapse in 11 days. As the senior editor of the Long War Journal, who's been covering this insurgency for the last dozen years of my life, I got to say that's inaccurate. The military and government did not collapse in 11 days. My colleague, Bill Roggio, has been producing a map of the insurgency in Afghanistan for several years. He documented in great detail how the insurgency was gaining steam over time, and he documented how this insurgency kicked off its final offensive around May 1st, a date we can come back to. So really the final act of this play was 3.5 months. It was from May 1st to mid-August. And I think that's important because I think that by saying it fell in 11 days, I think that connotes a certain ignorance of the insurgency strategy and what they were doing all along. And it's not just in terms of what the insurgency strategy behind it was. It was a certain underlying ignorance of the insurgents themselves. And this is a very difficult point to get at. It's almost unfathomable. But when I hear, during the hearing on Tuesday, I heard all three of the generals, I think, say, rightly, that the Taliban has not broken with al-Qaeda. That is correct. However, I also heard one of the generals say that there was, I think it was General Milley, say that there are remnants of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Well, the remnants word or similar verbiage has been used for more than 10 years in terms of describing al-Qaeda. It is a buzzword that has no meaning. And I want to explain what I mean by that. So in June of 2010, the U.S. government came up with an assessment of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and said there were only 50 to 100 al-Qaeda guys in Afghanistan at any given time. And so at Long War Journal, we kept covering this. Every time they killed 20 guys in Kunar or 30 guys in another province, this estimate was sticky. It never changed. It was always 50 to 100, 50 to 100. They never updated it to say, what does this actually look like? Well, that assessment, when it came out on June 2010, we now know, because we've been advocating for the release of these files, and we got the files from bin Laden's compound. So these are the files recovered in Osama bin Laden's Abbottabad compound. This is a contemporaneous memo that was written when the U.S. government started its assessment of what al-Qaeda looked like in Afghanistan. This memo was written to bin Laden 11 days beforehand. Okay? So this is contemporaneous. And here's what Osama bin Laden was told by his chief lieutenant. Sheikh, we have very strong military activity in Afghanistan, many special operations, and the Americans in NATO are being hit hard. He goes on to recount how al-Qaeda is not 50 to 100 across the whole country, but is in fact operating across 8 or more provinces at that time. They're operating with the permission and in conjunction and with collusion with the Taliban. In fact, one of the reasons why this is not ancient history, and I've got more memos here, is that one of the key figures identified in these memos to bin Laden, and again, these are my written testimonies, so you can see them for yourselves. I have the U.S. government's English translation, so everybody can download them. One of the key figures identified in these memos is a guy known as Siraj Haqqani. He is the one they're cooperating with, one of the main guys they're cooperating with on the ground in Afghanistan. That name should ring a bell. Siraj Haqqani has been the deputy emir of the Taliban, in other words, top 2, since 2015. The evidence is overwhelming that Siraj Haqqani is, in fact, an al-Qaeda man. And Siraj Haqqani, it should be noted here, his right-hand man protected Hamza bin Laden, Osama's son. His father protected Osama bin Laden. So the Haqqanis have been intertwined with Al-Qaeda, since the 1980s. And they now have a controlling share in the new Taliban regime. So this is all very important because this underestimation of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan all these years directly plays into the failures that we saw play out in the last several months. They also factor into our assessments of the Taliban regime. I'll wrap this up very quickly. I'll just say this. In recent weeks, we've also heard some current U.S. officials say that the Ghani network isn't really part of the Taliban or isn't wholly part of the Taliban. This is false. The Haqqani network not only has senior hierarchical positions throughout the Taliban, including Sirajuddin Haqqani's senior role now as the interior minister for the regime. The Haqqanis also control most of the most potent special forces for the Taliban, which actually won the war. And we know, based on all the evidence we've accumulated for many years, that al-Qaeda, in fact, played a key role in standing up those special forces. So one of the things I want to just leave this thought with you, and I'm eager to answer all your questions, is yes, the Taliban won this war, but so did al-Qaeda.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your testimony. Dr. Nasser, your written testimony indicates that there was a long sort of transition towards the events of August. And could you give us sort of a summary of the high points of that transition where the Taliban, and as Ms. Jocelyn indicated, that Taliban kept expanding its influence and working deliberately towards the events of August?
Mr. Chairman, even if we went back to 2015, 2016, the Taliban were steadily gaining territory. They had, through support of Pakistan, through varieties of other methods, had gained a great deal of military capability. And even though American forces were not on the forefront and the casualty numbers were down, but the casualty numbers of Afghan forces were rising. And if we looked at the gain in territory as a measure of how well the Taliban doing, they were winning. They were winning at a slow pace. The Doha Agreement essentially created a ceasefire between U.S. forces and the Taliban. But during those negotiations, the Taliban gains continued, and the casualty rate of the Afghan security forces continued to mount. The Taliban at Doha made a promise, I guess, that they would not inflict casualties on American troops, but they made no such promise about reining in either violence in Afghanistan or attacking Afghan security forces. And once and the surprising part is the pace at which they began to accumulate territory in 2021, leading up to the events of August. And that has a number of factors to it. One is the fact that they pragmatically made a lot more pacts with different warlords, with different tribal leaders who then influenced some members of their troops, some members of their tribes who were part of the troops. They made promise about protection of particular parts of Afghanistan if certain troops laid down their weapons. And we saw that whole-scale segments of the Afghan security forces made a deal. And finally, the Afghan security forces were poorly managed. They had not been paid for a very long time. And many said that the failure of the president of Afghanistan and the leadership in Kabul to create a united political front that the military could look up to and have confidence that there will be a political order after the United States left led them to the conclusion that there would not be a government surviving in Afghanistan. It was too weak, it was too divided, and therefore they began to devolve to protect their own personal interests. And that led to a snowballing effect, that a small force of 75 to 100,000 fighters, perhaps supplemented with vigilante or other fighters coming over the border from Afghanistan, was able to sweep across the country at a rapid clip.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jocelyn, we stick to, or try to stick to, a 5-minute deadline, so I only have a bit of time. But you've made the point very incisively about the persistence of al-Qaeda, the association of al-Qaeda. One of the issues that we took some comfort from was the fact that they were present, but they did not appear to have the ability to project power outside of Afghanistan. And that was the key sort of benefit of our presence. Can you just very quickly comment on that?
Very quickly, most of al-Qaeda's assets in Afghanistan were devoted to winning the war. Some of those assets were actually devoted to striking outside of Afghanistan. It is no doubt in my mind the U.S. presence did keep a lid on that. For example, right before the 2016 presidential election, a guy named Farouk al-Qahtani was killed in Kunar in a drone strike. He was actually one of the top external operations guys, that means targeting the West for al-Qaeda globally. I can give you, as you can probably guess, a lot of other details along those lines, but the bottom line is that you can cite guys like this who were taken out over the last several years even, who were absolutely involved in al-Qaeda's global operations.
And obviously we have to continue that, but now over the horizon, and we'll hopefully get to those questions later. But my 5 minutes has expired, and with the concurrence of the ranking member, emphasized that 5 minutes is the limit we like. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're going to have to. I have 3 questions I'd like to get to. I'm afraid I won't be able to. Hopefully, someone else will. Mr. Jocelyn, how do you think the Taliban will treat the Americans and even at-risk Afghans, the ones who are left behind? They're going to be hostages, or what's going to happen?
The at-risk Afghans are, at risk. I mean, I think that there's a lot of trouble ahead for them. We already see credible reports from Afghanistan of them hunting down former opposition, their former enemies. I think that their situation is dire. If I were a member of this committee, I'd be asking a lot about what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to the Americans who are left behind and what sort of wrangling is going on to try and get them out.
Good answer. And what are the terrorist groups saying about the Taliban, the Ghani, and the Al-Qaeda victory in Afghanistan? What are they saying? What's their communication right now?
So there's no doubt that the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan is a boon for the global jihadist movement and al-Qaeda in particular. We've tracked now over 30 statements across Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia from different al-Qaeda branches and affiliated groups and individuals who we know are important. They are all heralding this as a monumental historic victory. In fact, that's what al-Qaeda's senior leadership calls it as well.
Mm-hmm. And the administration has repeatedly mentioned that they could eventually support recognition of the Taliban as the legitimate government in Afghanistan. I'd like to have your ideas. I've got ideas, but I'd like to have your ideas on what this would mean.
I think to recognize the Taliban's regime as a legitimate government of Afghanistan would give them a political victory that would compound their military victory. They did not, remember, from 1996 to 2001, they were not recognized internationally. You can look at my written testimony and see that many of the same men who ran that regime from 1996 to 2001 are now running it once again, including Hassan Akhund, who's been named as the so-called head of state, who actually defied the UN when the UN demanded that Osama bin Laden be turned over. Akhund very publicly said, no, we're not going to do that. So I don't think there's any reason to reward them with recognition at this point. I think it's the new Taliban is the same old Taliban.
Well, those are great specific answers. Thanks so much. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. Senator Shaheen, please.
Oh, good. Senator Inhofe, can I have your 2 minutes?
No.
Dr. Nasser, I think one of the things that many Americans looked at with respect to our time in Afghanistan and felt proud of was the human rights that were afforded to women and the Constitution in Afghanistan that gave other minorities rights that they had not had under the Taliban or under previous governments. I appreciate that in the culture of Afghanistan, there are a lot of people who don't support that. But given what we know about the Taliban, is there any reason to think that they are going to treat women and girls any differently than the previous Taliban regime did? And if the answer to that is no, what should we be thinking about doing to address the human rights of women and girls in the country, which obviously are going to be at risk?
So, Shaheen, your observation is correct, and I think it even goes much broader. There's a large, modern, middle-class society that the United States helped set up in Afghanistan, which is now under threat. There's no reason to think that the Taliban, either because of their tribal views or because of their religious views, that are going to be supportive of the kinds of liberties and civil rights that Afghan women, minorities, and generally the Afghan civil society has. And I think the only leverage we have is to work with other countries around to put pressure on the Taliban, at least from top down, to make a recognition of these rights. There are certain things they want, not only from us, from China, from Russia, from Uzbekistan and the like, that should be made conditional on better behavior and observance of some of these laws.
Thank you. I'm going to ask both you and Mr. Jocelyn this next question because you mentioned in your comments, both of you mentioned the challenges of Pakistan. And how should we view Pakistan going forward, and how are they going to see the challenges because of the changes and the Taliban's now taking over in Afghanistan? Dr. Nasser, you want to go first on that?
Sure. I think we're going to have still difficulty dealing with Pakistan because Pakistanis have a particular view of what kind of Afghanistan is safe for them, what kind of Afghanistan will deny India a footprint close to their borders. And they have basically now, close to 3 decades, have invested in jihadism and in the Taliban as the horse that they're going to back. And so we're going to have very difficult relations with Pakistan on this issue. They do have enormous amount of influence in Kabul, and as Mr. Jocelyn said, with various elements of the Taliban. I think we should use that in a way to get some of the things that we want in Kabul, whether it's protection of human civil rights or other sets of issues. But we should not we should not kid ourselves that the Pakistanis are not supportive of a different Afghanistan than the one that is now we're seeing.
Mr. Jocelyn?
I have to note that Long War Journal, the publication I help run, has been banned in Pakistan physically for more than a decade. So the Pakistanis don't like our reporting on their duplicity and their sponsorship of our enemies in Afghanistan, who were obviously they were harboring and sheltering and facilitating the very same leaders who were sending insurgents to go kill Afghans and Americans and Europeans and others. So I have a very critical view of Pakistan's role in all this. I think if you go back through the history of all this, and if you do keep diving into the failures of the history of the war here, you should note that in late 2001, the State Department gave a list of demands under Secretary of State then Colin Powell and Dick Armitage to the Pakistanis. A good place to start exploring how Pakistan betrayed us and worked against us for all these years is you'll realize that I think only one of those 10 or 11 demands was actually satisfied.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't disagree with that at all. The question I have is, going forward, what should we be doing? Do we take a hard line with Pakistan? Do we think about what leverage points do we have as we're thinking about the future?
My point in bringing that up is I haven't seen any leverage all these years. That's my problem. So going back to 2001. So I can't imagine we have great leverage now. That's basically why I brought up that whole history.
Thank you. And can you say to what extent you think ISIS-K will be a challenge for the Taliban? And is that something that we should be looking to as a problem for them going forward?
So far, they have a very small presence in Nangarhar and some other areas of Afghanistan. They're doing basically roadside IED bombings against Taliban convoys. They're going to continue to fight the Taliban and al-Qaeda, by the way, but they don't have the power to overthrow the state the way the Taliban and al-Qaeda had the power to overthrow Kabul. So I think they're going to have a lingering issue there for the Taliban, but it won't be, to my mind, they're not going to start seizing significant territory anytime soon.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Kramer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you for being here. I want to focus a little bit on this, on the over-the-horizon strategy, which gets varying degrees of, enthusiasm, I suspect. But obviously, the generals have been pretty clear it's going to be much tougher to both collect data and to strike. Now, of course, in the last day or so, we're hearing that now the Taliban are calling on us to stop it. It's a breach of international laws and whatnot, and joining them is China. And I'd be interested to know a couple things. First of all, opinions about over the horizon as a strategy, and you probably won't say anything that we haven't already heard several times. But beyond that, is it possible for the Taliban to get systems from their friends in China or Russia that could actually prevent an effective over the horizon ISR and strike missions? I'll start with you, Mr. Jocelyn.
Yeah, I mean, I think my criticisms or concerns about over the horizon are basically a lot of what you heard on Tuesday and probably heard else. We don't have any basing rights right now in the region to launch even anything close to the theater. I would just add one concern I have, which is that after documenting this for so long, al-Qaeda in particular, the U.S. never really developed a working model of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, even across 20 years of being there. There were blind spots. There were large training facilities that operated for months at a time that nobody knew about. So this is going to get even more difficult now. The blind spots are going to get even larger, I would say, for that. In terms of China, all I would say is that they signaled very early on they were willing to deal with the Taliban. Even before the fall of Kabul and then immediately after the fall of Kabul, you saw the Taliban delegation that actually negotiated with the Americans in Doha made a trip to Beijing and was able to get pledges of some sort of support from the Chinese. I would very much keep tabs on that relationship.
Dr. Nasser, same, especially this relationship with our near-peer adversaries that we're supposed to put more focus on while we take our eye off of the war on terror. It looks to me like it might be the same war.
Well, there's no doubt that Afghanistan matters to China, and the Chinese are now much more vocal in terms of a policy there. It also matters to Russia greatly, matters to Iran. On some issues, they also have similar concerns as us, but they're also developing their own independent policies towards the Taliban. And that at some point does will interfere in the way in which we want to manage the Taliban or manage Al-Qaeda in that region. So I think the China factor is important. We often think about China as if it's only a Pacific Ocean power, but China is a West Asian power, is actually expanding further into West Asia, and Afghanistan is going to be pretty important. And I would say at least that one of the things that the Chinese off the bat have asked for from the Taliban in exchange for support is that that the Taliban would not set up bases or support their Uyghur Islamic minority, and that they would not encourage Islamic activism in Central Asia. So it remains to be seen whether that pledge holds, and what do the Taliban get in exchange for it.
Mr. Jocelyn, with regard to allies, we've heard some conflicting reports. Certainly our president speaks glowingly about his relationship across the world. The other day, General Milley did admit that our allies are probably at least questioning. What's your sense of how our allies are feeling right now and preparing right now, given what I think was not just a debacle, but it just appears like there's a lot of weakness right now. And I'm just wondering what our allies are thinking about the United States, in your view.
I'm very worried about our country overall in terms of our weak standing right now. I think you can note that the French, British, and Germans all made comments after this chaotic withdrawal, recognizing that there was a lack of American willpower here. I don't think this is just unique to this administration. I think we're dealing with real problems here long term. But the thing is that if the Europeans are saying they don't trust us, and these are some of our longest and closest allies going back to the revolution, I think we got a problem.
I have about 30 seconds left. Maybe, Mr. Jocelyn, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on our miscues in understating Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's really one of the more concerning issues for me.
I can't get over the fact that for all the hundreds of billions of dollars that were spent in this war in Afghanistan, that if you were to ask the decision makers and leaders of this war basic questions about Al-Qaeda and its relationship with the Taliban, I can assure you they would fail to answer them. They would not understand them. And because I've been doing this a long time, and it's dumbfounding. And so when you hear these buzzwords like remnants or degraded or decimated or on a shadow of its former self, these are all catchphrases, right? I always ask, what's the there? What's the evidence? We deal in evidence, right? That's what we deal in. Where's the evidence for what they're saying about all this? And so, as the U.S. has been saying that there's a minimal or non-existent Al-Qaeda presence, I can tell you that in Al-Qaeda's Arabic newsletter, Thabat, which we translate, they've been documenting that they're operating throughout the country, and they do that on a weekly basis. So why wasn't anybody checking on this to actually develop a working model that actually was rooted in evidence instead of wishful thinking?
Well, I sometimes wonder if they didn't know, we just have been understating it. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ranking Member Inhofe. I want to ask some questions about the expansion of control of Afghanistan by Taliban over time. In January of 2017, U.S. forces in Afghanistan were about 10,000, and then there were NATO forces, coalition forces too. The Afghan government was estimated by the DoD to be in control of 63% of the districts in Afghanistan in 2017. 1 year later, we had 8,600 troops, so we were down a bit. A BBC fairly intensive study suggested that the government was only in control of 30% of Afghanistan. And that matches something. There was a Special Inspector General report in 2018 just talking about historically, the number of districts controlled or influenced by the government has been falling since Seagar been reporting on it, while the number controlled or influenced by insurgents has been rising. President Trump took the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan down to about 2,500 when he left office, and it was sort of at that level when President Biden announced in April that we would leave by September. Do you know in April of 2021 what percentage of the country was controlled by the Afghan government, and what percent was either controlled by the Taliban or the Taliban were operating basically freely?
Senator, I'm kicking myself because my colleague has those statistics, and he tracked that very granularly every month, and I wish I had them in front of you to answer you. Maybe I can follow up with a specific answer. But the issue is it was dire. I mean, the number of districts that were controlled by the Afghan government had already slipped. They were basically priming the pump for this final offensive on May 1st. They had already, the way I described it, they had tied the nooses around all these provincial capitals, and they were waiting for May 1st to start to pull them.
Yep.
So that's...
And Dr. Nasser, do you have any additional on that? In April, what percentage of Afghanistan was controlled by the Afghan government?
Based on what I've heard, about 60 to 70% of the country was under Taliban control. But there was a great gray area in which they had great presence, if not total control.
Right. So there would be a shrinking percent, dramatically shrinking percent was in government control. A dramatically growing percent was in Taliban control. And then there was this gray area where maybe neither was in control, but the Taliban were operating significantly. So here's my question. If a force of 8,600 back in 2018 could only provide support to ensure government control of 30% of the country, what could we expect long-term from maintaining 2,500 U.S. troops in Afghanistan? I mean, weren't we just going to see, just a tiny fraction of the government, of the nation being controlled by the government if the U.S. had 2,500 troops there?
I think it's obvious that 2,500 was not going to turn the war around at all. I think what 2,500 would have done is it would have probably prevented the final collapse. That's the one thing it would have done. It would not have liberated all the territory under Taliban control. It would not. The Taliban probably, in my estimation, would have still taken some of the provincial capitals, maybe a number of them, even with 2,500 there. However, the only benefit I would see the 2,500 is, and I think Senator Inhofe was right about this, he wrote an op-ed in which he suggested that we use, at least keep a presence to test whether the Taliban has any, intention of actually sticking to anything in the Doha agreement, and that would have been a little bit better than just not testing them at all. That's what I would say. But it definitely was not, believe me, I'm not advocating for any kind of long-term 2,500 presence.
What would the U.S. troop strength have needed to be to enable the Afghan government to control Afghanistan and not the Taliban? Or is there no such number? Would infinity still have not been sufficient?
Senator, I don't want to sound flippant, but when it comes to counterfactuals on Afghanistan now, I often feel like it's sort of like saying, if I were a horse with a horn and wings, I'd be a unicorn, because at this point, I don't know what the counterfactual is that would have worked.
But you studied this and written about it for 20 years. So if the U.S. had 100,000, if we put 100,000 troops in, would the Afghan government have controlled the nation or not?
Well, they would have controlled much more of it, sure. I mean, not all of it, no.
Yeah, even with 100,000, they could.
They wouldn't have. When we had 100,000 in country, they didn't control all of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's kind of ironic that the Taliban and other terrorist groups ran Russia out of Afghanistan, and now it seems that the Taliban and Russia are somewhat cozy. Let me ask you, Mr. Jocelyn, what effect this debacle and the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, what effect that is likely to have on the former Soviet republics in the neighborhood, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and particularly Kazakhstan? Are they more surrounded now by Russia and vulnerable to Mr. Putin?
Well, there's two parts to that. There's the Putin angle, and then there's the Taliban angle. When it comes to the Taliban threat to the stands, there's a very clear danger to some of them, including Tajikistan. When you look at what the Taliban did, when we talk about how they cut off the north and they won the north, the way they did that was with al-Qaeda-affiliated Tajik groups, including Ansarullah, which is actually what took over about much of the territory this year and actually started controlling the border crossing with Tajikistan. So the Tajiks, you can see that Tajikistan is very concerned about all this right now when it comes to what's coming out of Afghanistan. They're harboring, they brought in the so-called resistance leaders that were in the Panjshir Valley. I've seen recent reports that they've relocated to Tajikistan. When it comes to Russia and all this, what I would say that's very curious is we were watching how Moscow was bringing delegations of the Taliban to Moscow to stand them up without the Afghan government being present, and they did this over and over again. They had to know that this was diplomatically contributing to the undermining the government of Afghanistan and Kabul. And it was so embarrassing for the Taliban at one point, they actually issued a statement saying, no, we know we beat them, the Mujahideen beat them in the first time around as the Soviets, but this is different. They basically had to explain it away for their own audience because it was that uncomfortable. But no, to me, it's not puzzling, but you can see that Moscow actually shifted its behavior here.
If you were the leadership of Kazakhstan, wanting to remain free from Russian domination as they've been now for some 20 years. What would your apprehension be?
I'd be concerned, obviously, that Russia is always going to look out for Russian interests first. That's what Moscow is going to look out for, and obviously not theirs. And I see a willingness from Moscow to do business with even jihadis in different areas.
Do they need to look to their south to be worried about Russia now?
Absolutely.
Okay, let me shift to one other thing. In the way we avoided going out into Kabul to rescue our friends, and in the way we signaled that we wanted to avoid casualties at any cost, does that send a signal? Haven't we over time resisted sending the signal to our enemies that we were averse to risking any casualties? And has the perception of our U.S. military changed because of what happened in Kabul?
I think that was absolutely the calculation behind withdrawal. Was I think the president decided, and I think President Trump had decided too, that they didn't want to risk any more casualties on the American side in Afghanistan any longer. What I can say about that is that since 2014, when you hear people say that the Afghans didn't fight for their country, I have to disagree with that. About 60 to 70,000 Afghans died under U.S. military leadership fighting for their country on the ground. They took on a lot of casualties. But since 2014, the Americans took on a very small number of casualties, including even up to the Doha agreement last year. You can see the number of casualties had decreased. Now, that's not explaining them away. You know, I think about the people who are lost there all the time. All I'm saying is we've absolutely signaled to the world that we are risk-averse in that regard.
Well, what is true also is that the Afghan military was trained almost entirely to fight with the close air support and the ground support of the United States military. Is that not correct? That's absolutely correct. You heard that even on Tuesday, where there was some mirror imaging, which was more part of the problem with the effort. The air support, the logistical support in that regard, if you're an Afghan fighting alongside the U.S. military and get logistical air support, and then all of a sudden one day it's gone, right? That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. You know, the Taliban was used to fighting without air support all these years. And I could tell you the then ambassador from Afghanistan to the United States called to me, a member of this committee, a couple of days before the fall and said, would you please implore the administration to return to close air support, and that did not happen. Had you heard that?
Oh, we were documenting it in real time. You could see that there were only, in the last several months, there were only sporadic air strikes by the Americans to come to the defense of the Afghans, and they were sporadic. They weren't anything that was going to actually keep them afloat. And part of the reason why they crumbled was they were used to fighting with close air support, and now they no longer had it.
Thank you, sir.
Senator King, please. Thank you, Senator Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are going to be lots of lessons from this episode, and I think one of the biggest ones is one that we keep not learning, and that is we don't understand other cultures. And Mr. Nasser, I think you started your testimony talking about we think everybody thinks like us, and everybody wants to be a liberal democracy, and everybody wants to have elections, and everybody wants to have a structure, and we don't understand the ethnic divisions, the sending Tajik troops to Pashtun areas, and this is more of a comment than a question, but it seems to me this is something Americans, we get that wrong. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, that's one of the fundamental errors of American foreign policy, is thinking and not understanding other cultures. Here's my question. Mr. Nasser, you testified, the quote was, Doha ended the war. And I think that's really important, that the die was cast when the administration agreed. Number one, they made a deal with the Taliban excluding the Afghan government entirely. And number two, it was a fixed May 1st, 2021, American troops are going to be out. That was our war in Afghanistan was over when that agreement was signed. Now, President Biden could have reversed it. I understand that. But that was the crucial moment, was it not, in terms of the beginning of the collapse of the morale of the Afghan government and the Afghan military? And the only real condition was that there would be negotiations, which never occurred, and we didn't enforce, as near as I can tell. Is that correct? Wasn't the Doha agreement the real, that was the end of the war in all practical senses?
Yes, Senator. That's my understanding. That when Doha agreement, first of all, the negotiations already send a very powerful signal to the region that the United States was willing to negotiate with the Taliban directly. And that was obviously very different from our attitudes towards the Taliban for over the past 15 years. And secondly, that we did arrive at an agreement. The agreement was around a ceasefire and an exit of the United States from Afghanistan.
And people talk about it being conditions-based, but the conditions were pretty vague and they were never enforced. The only real condition was not harboring al-Qaeda and negotiations with the Afghan government, neither one of which occurred. And I asked the generals that were here the other day, were there any efforts to enforce those conditions or to pause the withdrawal? And the answer I got was no. So let me ask this question. If President Biden had decided in April to abrogate the Doha agreement, number one, what would have happened with regard to the Taliban's ceasefire with the Americans? And number two, what would have been required in order to return to a situation where the Afghan government could retain some measure of control? In other words, where would we have had to go? I think your testimony, Mr. Jocelyn, was 2,500 troops wasn't going to do it. Clearly, there would have been an escalation of our presence. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The 2,500 troops were only viable at that point in time because there was a ceasefire. In fact, the 2,500 troops were not permitted for under the Doha agreement. So in a sense, we would have needed even a force protection plan to just protect those 2,500. And then, there could be a military assessment to see how many more troops would have needed to stabilize the situation and give the Afghan government breathing room. I would say that when the Doha agreement started, we had multiples of that, close to 30,000 troops, perhaps more. And we still were not able to stave off the Taliban offensive.
Was this mission doomed almost from the beginning?
My testimony was that there were strategic problems with our approach right after we toppled the Taliban in 2001 that sowed the seeds of an insurgency that we were never able to control.
Mr. Jocelyn, you talked about the resurgence of al-Qaeda, and I don't doubt it. I think you're absolutely right, and it's certainly going to be a problem, and I think the over-the-horizon solution is being oversold. On the other hand, the whole safe havens argument, the trouble with that is we'd have troops everywhere. I mean, there's safe havens potentially in Mali, in Syria, in Yemen. How should we react to the trying to control al-Qaeda when it's now metastasized throughout the Middle East and, in fact, into Africa?
Senator, it's a valid point. We've tracked how the al-Qaeda has spread out over time to those areas you just mentioned, and it is the case that today al-Qaeda would not need to train the 9/11 hijackers, let's say, in Afghanistan the way they did in the late 1990s and 2000. You can go to the 9/11 Commission report. All 19 were trained there. They could get training in a number of different places now. The problem is that Afghanistan now is the only one of those areas I can think of where the government is al-Qaeda's ally. And so they have a special amount of protection that they don't have in those other areas, where they have local adversaries that they have to fend off in those other areas that they don't necessarily have to fend off now in Afghanistan, other than the remnants of ISIS, and I'll use remnants there, remnants of ISIS in Afghanistan. And I think the other point is that this is a boon for them in terms of their messaging. Remember, the jihadis have a strategic ideological problem, which is that they weren't able to win anywhere. They weren't able to actually, ISIS lost its caliphate.
ISIS was a collapse.
Right, it collapsed. Now they've won. And now they have a victory message to go out and say, we won here in Afghanistan. Not only did the Soviets lose to the Mujahideen the first time around, to Jalaluddin Ghani, by the way, but his son, Surajuddin Ghani, now defeated the Americans the second time around. That's a pretty powerful message.
My time is up. If there's any one phrase that summarizes what happened is the Taliban saying that the Americans have the watches, but we have the time.
Absolutely.
That's what happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your willingness to appear before this committee and to answer questions on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. You are both recognized experts in this region. this committee and others have focused exhaustively on the damage the withdrawal has done to our national security and the challenges our nation faces as we look to the future. I'd like to focus on two nuclear powers in that region and the impact on our ability to develop relationships with both Pakistan and with India. Clearly, this is an area in which you have two countries that we have relied on and have worked with, and yet they don't see eye to eye. They have border conflicts. It's a hot spot. They are both nuclear armed, and yet we need to be able to coordinate our diplomatic efforts and our military relationships with both. With Afghanistan now a location where, as General Milley has suggested, there will be a place for al-Qaeda, and they will be able to begin the planning for additional attacks against our homeland out of Afghanistan. Can you share with us your thoughts about the relationship that we have to develop in order to maintain what the administration wants to do with regards to an over-the-horizon capability directly into Afghanistan, and yet at the same time, the diplomatic challenges we have trying to work with both India and with Pakistan? Mr. Jocelyn, would you like to begin?
I am very skeptical of our ability to deal with Pakistan and have any kind of leverage there whatsoever in dealing with them. When it comes to over-the-horizon strike capabilities, you've already seen senior Pakistani officials basically say they're not going to give it to us, and I don't know if they'll change their minds. But remember, President Obama, when they launched the raid on Osama bin Laden, didn't inform the Pakistanis that we were coming because we didn't trust them. Remember back in the 1990s when cruise missiles were launched at al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan in response to the embassy bombings. We didn't tell, or the Pakistanis, I'm sorry, we did tell the Pakistanis, and they tipped off bin Laden at the time, and he escaped. This is the type of problems that we've been dealing with Pakistan going back to the 1990s in all this regard. If I just may say one thing real quick, when it comes to all this and the question you're asking about a nuclear armed state, in my testimony, I use a phrase, my written testimony, I use a phrase called Wheel of Jihad. Pakistan has sponsored and harbored and worked with the Ghanis and senior Taliban officials and mid-level Taliban officials to win the war in Afghanistan. The complexity of this is that those same parties are in bed with al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban, which comes back around against the Pakistani state. And so it is a case, and I think you heard the general say something like this on Tuesday, that they could have miscalculated here. You have a nuclear-armed state that's been a hotbed of jihadism now for 2 generations or more, and they have been deeply in bed with some of the same parties that are actually working with the entities that actually threaten the Pakistani state. So that's something to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Mr. Nasser?
Well, it's very clear that India is particularly unhappy with U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. They see it as a absolute strategic defeat, and they have their worries. But we have to be careful also that not to put the past as a model for the future. Things have changed quite considerably. India is not part of the Quad for us. It's about our China policy. China now has a strategic partnership with Pakistan that didn't exist before. And Afghanistan is not the only issue as we try to navigate between these two powers. And the Chinese themselves now have a much bigger voice in Afghanistan than they did before. And so we have to navigate a much more complicated set of issues than was the case in the past. And the Pakistanis also have certain leverage because of the relationship with China that does impinge on our ability to pressure them.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Rounton. For the information of my colleagues and the witnesses, the vote has now been pushed back to 11 a.m. With that, let me recognize Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the recent testimony from military leaders stating that we were overly optimistic about the capacity of the Afghan military to fight the Taliban, or that we didn't quite assess properly that once our logistics was no longer there to support them, once our air support wasn't there, once our contractors weren't there, that they didn't have the confidence to fight against the Taliban. Nor did we fully recognize that many of the Afghan military, when given the option of putting down your weapons or dying, they wanted to put down their weapons. And we now know that's largely because they didn't have faith in the government in Afghanistan, that the corruption there was too significant and that they didn't want to die or see their families die to fight for that particular government. Do we run the risk of not understanding or being overly optimistic about other training missions around the world? And if so, where? And what recommendations do you have for changes to our strategy of training partner forces to counter violent extremist groups? And to further amplify Senator King's question, it seems that we were not thoughtful enough about the culture in which we were trying to instill our democratic values, to the extent that we didn't have the appropriate or the knowledge of what would actually happen.
Senator, I think you pointed a number of key issues, but also I would add to that the fact that the soldiers had not been paid for 6 to 8 months is quite important. I mean, they literally had serious grievances that what was meant to be for their salaries was being hoarded by military leaders, civilians that have been put in charge of the military or generals by the government in Kabul. There was a tremendous amount of disgruntlement. They did not look at the Kabul government as a political leadership that they would respect or that can keep the Afghan together. And also that at a critical point, the Taliban began negotiating with the tribal leaders of the tribes that these soldiers came from. And if there's not going to be a government in Kabul, there were all these kinds of tribal deals that protection would be given to a particular region or a particular tribe or a particular province if the soldiers laid down their weapons. So it was not so much about them not being willing to die, is that essentially the Afghan military began to dissolve along Afghan lines, along the lines of tribal conversations, etc. And I think what we ought to learn is that we cannot lead a military only on military matters and not have a say on whether the soldiers are getting paid. We cannot lead a military on military matters when we don't have a say on who their commanders are, or if the president of Afghanistan decides to put some political appointee in charge of operations. So there was a discrepancy between treating Afghanistan as a sovereign state when in essence we were the military and we were not in control of every aspect of the military operation.
Do you therefore not say that one of the original sins then was not including the Afghan government in the negotiations in Doha?
Yes, I think that was a big problem because we delegitimized the Afghan government, not only in the mind of Afghans, but everybody else around the Middle East. I know that countries were. This is a sovereign country that is our ally, except when we went to the negotiating table, and we also did not bring the Afghan security forces as an independent military combatant force that was doing the fighting to the ceasefire negotiations. So we basically chopped them off at the legs. We sent a signal that we were recognizing only the Taliban as our interlocutor in Afghanistan. And I think American withdrawal from Afghanistan and its regional reverberations started with the Doha Agreement, not in the summer. I think it was clear that we were leaving, and we were leaving the country to the Taliban. That's when Iranians, Chinese, Russians, everybody started diplomatic initiative with the Taliban because they saw that basically they were coming.
In the summer of 2000?
No, before that, Senator. When the Doha Agreement was being negotiated, the understanding was that the United States is negotiating its exit with only one political force called the Taliban. So sooner or later, these are masters of Kabul. There won't be a government. The Afghan government doesn't matter. If the Afghan government doesn't matter to the United States, it doesn't matter to anybody else either.
So therefore, failure was baked in the cake because of the negotiations.
Well, the negotiations brought us to the summer. I mean, all the essence of it, from the ceasefire, from troop numbers, from the date of the exit, and essentially from who literally would be deciding the fate of Afghanistan, was baked into the negotiations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I tend to agree with Senator King's comments about us trying to project expectations for the society we have here in other parts of the world. But I also have to say that with half of the nearly 39 million people who live in Afghanistan being under the age of 19, they've seen a very different opportunity than generations before them in Afghanistan. And I think the number is somewhere around 60%, just below 70% are under the age of 25. So to the people who served there, I think it's important to think that we've sowed a seed that may give them an opportunity after the current conflict resolves itself and the almost impossible to assume otherwise a civil war that's going to occur there in the coming years. I've heard the 2,500 number discussed in the prior hearing and this hearing, and I just want to see if I can get agreement with you all on what the real number is. We heard General Miller a few weeks ago and General Milley and General McKenzie this week say that the 2,500 were fighters. You know then that there's going to be some logistical tail to support those fighters. You heard General Milley say that depending upon circumstances, they would probably have to have a surge capacity of another 3,500. But what hasn't been talked about is the unusual situation where our NATO allies and partners were talking about another 6,000. So the number is really 8,000 to 10,000 dispersed across the country, not only with fighters, but also with intelligence assets and other strike capabilities. And to use General Miller's term, he believed, with the advice that he got from people in forward positions, that that would be a sufficient number to put the hands on the shoulders of the Afghan national forces and probably keep a reasonably stable environment. Would you all agree with those numbers? We're not talking about 2,500. We're talking about something between 8,000 and 9,500 that would be in country to stabilize the situation?
Senator, that sounds accurate. The only thing I'll say is for years we haven't been able to get reliable public numbers out of the Defense Department about what the forces actually look like in Afghanistan, so I can't say with certainty that that's right, but that sounds about right. And I don't think when you say put a hand on the shoulder of the Afghan security forces, what that number would have done, that platform would have done, it would have prevented it would not have turned the situation around. It would not have won the war. What it would have done would probably prevented how quickly we saw the collapse. It probably would have done that. I think you would have seen Afghan forces would have fought in different parts of the country to keep the country under the control of the government in a better way, especially if they had the logistical air support. But it obviously wasn't going to win the war.
Yeah. Well, and incidentally, I was against the Doha Agreement in the prior administration. We heard General Milley testify that it was clear last year that the Taliban were not living up to the spirit or the letter of the agreement. President Biden had to know that when he was making a campaign promise to move forward with the withdrawal. It would just seem to me, and I don't buy the argument that the only reason that we moved forward with the withdrawal was because it was a prior agreement, because we've seen reversals of other decisions made by the prior administration. But it would just seem to me that even if the ultimate goal was to exit Afghanistan or to potentially exit but maintain a diplomatic presence, that if the administration had listened to the advice of at least some people with extensive experience on the ground in Afghanistan, that you could have reset and said, we actually meant that the terms of the Doha Agreement had to be satisfied. We meant that the Taliban had to work with the Afghan government for some sort of a peaceful transition. And we just simply got so focused on exiting that we did so at the expense of 13 military personnel and what I believe will be thousands of people who were left behind. The last question is on over the horizon. You know, and I think Senator King said that he's not sure that, I think you said that maybe over the horizon is being oversold. If we really believed with the issues of the air corridors and the lack of reliance or the lack of credibility with the Pakistani government, if we believe that we can conduct counterterrorism and intelligence missions over the horizon in Afghanistan, a landlocked country with very, very narrow corridors to execute, why wouldn't we withdraw from any other dangerous place in the world
where we have a coast and we have air pathways. Why wouldn't that be the logical conclusion you would draw? If you can do it in Afghanistan, then you can do it in Somalia and another dangerous place where we think we need to be there to maintain assets, to protect the homeland and U.S. interest. Why wouldn't that be the logical conclusion?
No, it would be the logical conclusion, Senator. And the bottom line is, every time we've talked to the military over the last 15 years or whatever it was, talk about over the horizon was always problematic. It wasn't necessarily a good thing. Afghanistan is going to be even more problematic in a lot of ways. Just on the Doha agreement real quick, I was very loudly critical of that as early as 2018. And then again in 2019, you can Google me and Google the Doha agreement. I laid it all out for everybody very quickly what was going to happen. There's another part of the Doha agreement that I think you, Senator, should pay attention to, which is, I don't have it in front of me, but Section 1F of the agreement actually prevents the U.S. from using military force in Afghanistan. And so if the U.S. says that this agreement is binding and in effect, the Taliban will say, well, therefore, you cannot then use any kind of force in Afghanistan. And in fact, just yesterday, the Taliban released a statement in English saying that the flying of U.S. drones over Afghan airspace was a violation of the Doha agreement. They actually, when Secretary Austin said that the Ghanis, including Sergio Ghani, he implied that he could still be targeted by the U.S., the Taliban came out and said, no, the Doha agreement says you can't target him, that actually he's protected by the Doha agreement, which means, in effect, the Doha agreement, if we accept that reading, is protecting al-Qaeda.
Thank you, Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When General Miller appeared before this committee at his nomination hearing in 2018, I quoted 4 previous Defense Department leaders who'd come before this committee and proclaimed that we had finally turned the corner in Afghanistan. I said that we had turned the corner so many times that we were going in circles. That was in 2018. And for years before that, DOD leaders told this committee and the American people about the progress we were making. But as we know from the Afghanistan papers published by the Washington Post, that simply wasn't true. As early as 2006, senior leaders knew that the Afghan government under Karzai had, quote, self-organized into a kleptocracy, end quote. And in 2010, David Petraeus reportedly said in a Situation Room meeting that the Afghan government was a, quote, criminal syndicate. Dr. Nasser, do you think that a kleptocratic government that acts like a criminal syndicate is likely to win and maintain genuine support from the population?
No, Senator, it did not. And as I said in my testimony, when we had mission creep from fighting terrorism to state building in Afghanistan, and the amount of money that we put into it actually created circumstances that made the war more difficult. So
I actually want to go directly to that point. We knew that the Afghan government was weak. We knew that there was little effective oversight. And even so, over the years, the United States poured hundreds of billions of dollars into Afghanistan. So let me ask you, Dr. Nasser, by flooding the country with cash like we did, were we fueling corruption in the country?
Yes, the corruption obviously was based on the money that came from the outside. There was no money within Afghanistan itself, and that did cause unhappiness. It caused disgruntlement, and it did help Taliban recruitment going forward. And part of the legitimacy problem of the Afghan government is corruption. And I think in the collapse of the Afghan security forces, we saw that again, that most of the money that was supposed to go to salaries lined the pockets of commanders.
We also know that the public military assessments of the Afghan National Security Forces were wildly inaccurate. In 2008, General David McKiernan said, quote, I will report to you that the Army is on the right path. The Afghan Army has good soldiers. We are developing that Army from scratch. It is well trained. It is well led, end quote. Then in 2010, General Mattis said, quote, this is the worst nightmare for the Taliban, that the Afghan army is increasingly effective, partnered with our forces and moving against an enemy that they know better than anyone, end quote. And there are a whole lot more statements like that I could read. I won't continue to quote them. despite a decade plus of rosy public statements like that and throwing truckloads of money and the finest American equipment at them, when we said we were leaving, the Afghan army collapsed almost instantly. So, Mr. Jocelyn, given how quickly the army collapsed, do you think they would have been able to truly stand on their own with just another few months or years of American assistance and training?
It's tough to answer in years. Months, definitely not. Another year, probably not. There were a lot of problems baked in here. I mean, we shared, Senator, you were reading all these comments from the generals. Long War Journal, the publication I run, we've been documenting this for years, that there were all sorts of rosy assessments that were given that did not match what we were documenting. So we're, in agreement.
So we spent $80 billion training and equipping the Afghan National Security Forces. Let me ask you, Dr. Nasser, that's taxpayer money. Was that money well spent?
With benefit of hindsight, no.
No. So I agree. That money could have done so much more good at home. And instead, we foolishly tried to build an army without stable state institutions under it. This Afghan experience should humble everyone in this room. It should cause us all to reflect on how badly our country and our leaders got it wrong over the course of 2 decades. The rosy predictions we heard for years failed time after time, and there was no accountability for it. I hope that each of us will start exercising a great deal more skepticism the next time that we are asked to support putting our service members in harm's way and to engage in major military operations abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Scott, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. Dr. Nasser, you tweeted against the Trump administration in 2019 that he was costing the U.S. credibility and creating instability. We heard this week from General Milley, and he said that President Biden's decision to leave Americans and the Afghan partners behind in Afghanistan, allowing the Taliban to take over, has done substantial damage to American credibility. So for both of you, do you think that the withdrawal, the way we've done the withdrawal, has impacted American credibility?
I think the entire endgame in Afghanistan has damaged American credibility. We waged our longest war in this country and then ended up negotiating an unhappy agreement with an enemy that we said we would never talk to. And then we withdrew very rapidly, and what we hoped would stand up when we go collapsed completely. And so we are in a position where our ability to see through our projects are suspect, our ability to stick with our strategies are suspect, and also our ability to execute our policies are suspect. So I agree. I do think the whole thing has damaged our credibility.
I agree with Dr. Nasser. I think the whole end game here has damaged our credibility. I think particularly this year, the scenes we witnessed in Kabul, as somebody who monitors the jihadi world very closely, those scenes are playing out across the world right now in recruitment videos and propaganda and media. They took the last shot of the last American soldier leaving Kabul, which CENTCOM put online for some reason. They take that shot and they put it next to the last Soviets leaving Afghanistan and next to an image that's supposed to be the British leaving. And what the jihadis around the world are saying is, see, we defeated the Americans just as the Soviets and the Brits were defeated here.
Would each of you view and do you think the American people should view the Pakistan as an ally? And do you think if so, do you think they'll remain an ally?
Pakistan was not an ally on our project in Afghanistan. Their interests were not aligned with ours. They wanted a different kind of government in Kabul, and they bet on the Taliban to bring it about. And we continuously were trying to square the circle with the Taliban and with Pakistan, and it didn't work.
No, Pakistan is not our ally. Pakistan was the Taliban's ally, and they helped defeat us in this war.
So who right now, based on our lack of credibility and just not the lack of relationships, who's going to be our ally over there to fight terrorism?
Among the major countries that are around Afghanistan, we don't have a very obvious ally because China, Iran, and Russia are not likely to be cooperating with the United States closely on counterterrorism. Pakistan remains to be seen. We might get some things from Pakistan on the margins, but not if it means bringing down the Taliban or completely changing the composition in Kabul. So we're left to be working with our Persian Gulf Arab allies like Qatar, UAE, or with Uzbekistan and the like on these sets of issues. So we don't have an obvious strong ally over there.
I agree with that too. I think we don't have an obvious strong ally. We certainly don't have any allies in theater right now. And I think regionally, the situation is, of course, a mess. We don't even have any basing around Afghanistan right now to conduct operations. So I don't think we have any clear alliances against the jihadis right now.
So how's this going to impact, how's our withdrawal from Afghanistan going to impact India?
My understanding, talking to a lot of people there, is that they're very worried about first of all, Pakistan becoming much more bullish now that the United States has left and their allies have taken over Afghanistan. And secondly, that they will be cut off from Central Asia because they also are losing their footprint of access through Iran as well. And that is all to China's benefit. And finally, they're worried that Afghanistan may become a base of operations against India.
One of the ways that al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan was underestimated was the role of Kashmiri jihadists who were going to Afghanistan for training and then going back to Kashmir to fight Indian forces. And in fact, for a time, one of al-Qaeda's biggest paramilitary commanders, the biggest paramilitary commander in Afghanistan, had fought in Kashmir, named Ilyas Kashmiri. They've had their sights on Kashmir and fighting Indian forces there all along. I expect to see an uptick in operations there. There's also a footprint, a terrorist cellular footprint in India itself, and I expect you're going to see more operations inside India.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Reid.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reid, for the hearing, and thanks to each of our witnesses. I think it's critically important that we do a strategic assessment of what happened in Afghanistan over the 20-year time frame, and hopefully we'll be getting that kind of assessment, and it won't get buried as other previous assessments have been made with previous conflicts if folks don't like what comes out of those assessments. But we need to do it. My question is going to be for both of you. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction Report on Lessons Learned in Afghanistan stated that the State Department was unable to craft a strategy for the ways and means of this mission in Afghanistan for a variety of reasons. And the only organization that was well positioned to fill that void was the Department of Defense. So my question to both of you, could you give me an assessment of our diplomatic efforts in Afghanistan, and what could we have done differently that would have been more successful over the span of years that we were there? Dr. Nasser, we'll start with you.
Based on my experience, we did not have a diplomatic effort in Afghanistan for a very long period of time. I don't mean the embassy, but in the sense that there was very little diplomacy going on. The State Department was put in a position to do nation building, oversee irrigation, building electricity, helping with development of agriculture and the like. And I don't think the State Department was well suited for that mission, and therefore was not capable of achieving those goals, especially in a country like Afghanistan.
So what should have been done differently?
Well, I think we should have had a different approach to the agencies of the U.S. government that would be in charge of state building. But it is also a completely new task for the United States. I mean, what we did in Afghanistan of trying to take a country that had virtually no institutions, had been through 2 decades of civil war, and try to create a viable economy, create bureaucracies, create banks, redig the irrigation channels, create a finance system, for instance, that Afghanistan didn't have. These were tall orders that we hadn't done before.
Thank you. Mr. Jocelyn?
That's a tough question to answer quickly. All I would say is that there should have been a lot more internal diplomacy within Afghanistan, understand the different factions, the different competitors, not just dealing unilaterally with the government of Afghanistan. There were other parties that could have had more regular diplomatic contact. I think critically, I think the U.S. didn't drop the ball from 2001 on and didn't have any sustained diplomatic pressure on Pakistan at all. There should have been at least an attempt to have a sustained campaign to keep pressure on Pakistan when it comes to the Pakistani safe havens. It may not have worked, but at least it would have been better than this sort of erratic policy making that we saw.
Dr. Nasser, the IMF, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve, and Asian Development have all frozen Afghan government's accounts overseas or ceased disbursement to funds to the Afghans. And coupled with hundreds of thousands of Afghan public servants, members of the security services, and other individuals who are no longer receiving a paycheck, I think we all know Afghanistan is facing a very precarious situation and a humanitarian situation. The question for you, though, is what is the appetite, both of the Taliban to court foreign investment and that of the global business community and other governments to invest in Afghanistan? And how do we balance the need to take a look at the humanitarian issues with preventing any money from going to the Taliban? It's obviously a complex situation. What do you recommend for us going forward?
There is no Afghan that I've talked to who believes that starving the Afghan people right now is a good idea. And although it's understandable why IMF and the World Bank will not give money to a government that hasn't been recognized internationally, but if the situation continues, the Afghan people will suffer. There's now reports that 97% of the country could fall under poverty, and there could be famine in Afghanistan, and the Taliban could unravel if they cannot meet payroll, if they cannot manage the country. And those could create more dire situations for us. We have to work with other actors who are engaged in Afghanistan, from Qatar to Russia to China to Uzbekistan, etc., to come up with an economic path for that would not be supporting the Taliban's worst behavior, but would make sure that fundamental things like food and other humanitarian things would reach the Afghan people. Some of those could be done without giving them funds. It essentially requires direct aid in terms of food and other material for people of the country.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Before I recognize Senator Sullivan, I'm going to go over and vote and ask Senator King to continue. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would appreciate the witnesses being here today. We had a hearing 2 days ago that had a lot of information that we received. I'd like to get your gentlemen's assessment on what is a clear disagreement between the President of the United States' assessment of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and his chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The President has referred to this retrograde operation as a, quote, extraordinary success. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs called it a logistical success, strategic failure. I've shown this cover story from the Economist magazine with banner headlines calling it Biden's debacle and going into all these sub-articles about America's standing in the world is significantly diminished. China is enjoying seeing America humbled. These are different articles. What's your gentleman's assessment? Strategically, what that's done to our interests, our credibility, and our...
I think the whole end game, as we discussed, was a debacle. I think it's absolutely hurt American credibility, and really, I think if you're an American ally or partner, you now have to question, how much America is going to come to your defense or stand with you. I think that those are the questions that the Chinese are asking, for example, with Taiwan right now, and with others. So I think this whole thing absolutely speaks to American weakness, and that's what I'm concerned about long run.
Let me just follow up on that, and then I do want to get our other witnesses' answer to the question. You mentioned weakness. So one thing I've been mentioning to the administration, I worry, and to be quite frank, we've seen it. The Chinese are already saber-rattling with regard to Taiwan openly, right? Kind of in our face, in Taiwan's face. You can't trust the Americans. Here we come. I think other adversaries of ours, Iran, Russia, are going to be testing us, whether Iran and Israel, Russia and the Baltics. Do you agree with that? China, certainly in Taiwan, do you agree with that assessment? And my caution to the administration is better be ready, better be tough. What's your sense on that?
I totally agree. I think we're going to be tested across the board in the coming months and years now. I think we've already been being tested in various ways the last several years. And even if you look at the whole period, really from 9/11 on, there's been one test after another. But now I think that we're probably at one of our weakest points, I would say.
Dr. Nasser?
Senator, clearly the end game in Afghanistan has not been our finest moment at various stages. And I think different allies...
But not an extraordinary success.
No, I think the lessons are different for various countries around the world, whether there are allies or there are adversaries. To our allies and adversaries, it looks generally that the United States will tire of its strategies, that it ultimately did not win this war, that ultimately it said it would never talk to the Taliban. It talked to the Taliban, and when it came to the end game, that it didn't manage its own exit well, and there was more damage done on the way out than when we were in. So I think countries are going to look at what it means for them. I would say our enemies may look and say that they can wait out our strategies ultimately. That we can be pushed out of regions of the world if they have the time and the effort. And our allies are really worried as well, because they think that they could be the next President Ghani or the next Afghan military as well.
Yeah. Let me ask one final question, Mr. Chairman, and it's a two-part question. One is more tactical, operational, and then one is strategic as it relates to our allies, for both of you. I had the honor of having breakfast with my old boss, Condoleezza Rice, and some of her colleagues at the Hoover Institution, very, very smart foreign policy thinkers. And they were all just mentioning the real strategic aspects of Bagram, where it's located, what you can do with it, keeping it close to China, close to Russia, Central Asia, India, Pakistan. So strategically important. That's now gone, of course. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Chinese or Russians there soon. And then India. I worry about, a growing jihadist sanctuary in Afghanistan will force our growing partnership, which I think has been very important with regard to India, to have to devote greater resources and bandwidth there, as opposed to working with us on addressing what I see as certainly the biggest challenge of the 21st century, which is the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the export of their authoritarian model around the world. Could you gentlemen quickly, I know I've run out of time, Mr. Chairman, comment on those? Bagram, strategic, India, strategic.
I would say very briefly, Senator, that I always have thought that we should have thought about Afghanistan not just in terms of Al-Qaeda, but also in terms of China. China is not a Pacific power. China is an Asia power, and it's actually moving more and more in West Asia. And we should have looked at Afghanistan as a way of containing China's westward move. But that
Bagram would have certainly helped that.
Bagram would have certainly helped that, yeah.
Any thoughts on India?
I agree with your assessment that the concern when it comes to India now having to deal with a rising jihadi challenge and a distraction from the competition with China. I also agree with what Dr. Nasser said, that there should have been a more holistic look at Afghanistan in terms of the Chinese threat and what's going on in terms of what you're talking about with Bagram and other ways too. I would just say this, we couldn't even get the Al-Qaeda part right in Afghanistan, so I can't really argue we should have done a better job when thinking about China or any of these other issues when we failed on one of our fundamental missions. And that's my main concern here, is that something that should have been narrowly defined and we have a narrow focus on that we really understand, we didn't get right.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
By WebEx, Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much, and thank both of you for sharing your expertise with us today. Mr. Jocelyn, in your written testimony, you outlined how the bond between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda still goes unbroken. In 2014, you testified before Congress saying that since Al-Qaeda's founding, its assets have not been focused on attacking us, but on waging insurgencies against local governments. So my question would be, now that Al-Qaeda can now enjoy a really friendly relationship with Taliban government in power in Afghanistan, do you believe their priorities will shift from establishing footholds first, since they already have it, to now launching attacks first?
Senator, thank you for bringing that up. I forgot about that quote. I think what I said probably was that most of their assets or resources since their founding were devoted to waging local insurgencies against local governments, not actually toward attacking us. Only a small part of the resources were always devoted to attacking us. And in my testimony today, you can see I added a line, actually, I think it was the last line I added to the written testimony, saying that now that they've won in Afghanistan, those personnel are going to have more resources to devote toward regional and global operations.
Okay, so my follow-up would be, I'm concerned over the over-the-horizon strikes. That's supposed to keep everything at bay. But will that simply delay? It's not going to deter terrorists from launching attacks against us, I don't believe. And now that we're out of Afghanistan, how do we go after the foundation organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS?
No, I agree, Senator. I think the over-the-horizon model is going to be very problematic. Even when the U.S. had a large footprint in Afghanistan, we couldn't get a working model of Al-Qaeda. The U.S. couldn't to figure out how to really degrade them. They talked about Al-Qaeda being decimated for so long, they actually never got around to defeating Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I think that there have been large training camps, including in 2015, one of the largest training camps in Al-Qaeda's history in Afghanistan was found in October 2015. It took something like 3 to 6 days of airstrikes and special operations raids to destroy it. We don't have that capacity now to go destroy a camp like that. And it's not something that could be done just with over-the-horizon strikes.
Let me ask you, do we have to have separate, what I would think, separate strategies against Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Or we have one strategy that's going to attack both?
I think we have to think about them as they're both obviously jihadists. In some cases, they actually have shared the same personnel over time. I think we have to be very careful. I think there's been this tendency to think that we could work with the Taliban in particular against ISIS. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. The problem is that when you do that, you're also working with Al-Qaeda's so-called local branches or just even outright Al-Qaeda in the fight against ISIS. And I don't think that really serves any greater strategic interest to the U.S. So we shouldn't look at it as, well, now that we have this ISIS threat, we have to worry about ISIS so we can work with the Taliban, which is allied with Al-Qaeda, against ISIS. We have to look at it as somewhat as a distinct threat stream is what I would say.
Thank you. Dr. Nasser, this would be for you, and Dr. Jocelyn, Mr. Jocelyn, if you want to chime in also. Part of the reason we left Afghanistan was to focus our efforts on defense spending towards the rising great power competition. That's the reason that we have used it to leave that the way we did. But China and Russia are increasingly defying international rules and norms, and we can't turn a blind eye towards that. I'm a believer that we can walk and chew gum, however, and while we need to be countering these bad actors, I also see opportunities where we can work together, maybe. I don't understand that at all with them. So my question would be, what areas do you think that China and Russia, their intent with Afghanistan in the region, and what do we need to be concerned about to thwart, if we could, to make sure we're in front of this? And then my follow-up would be, what overreaching strategic goals should we have with Russia and China trying to make a foothold or make gains there would be detrimental to us?
I believe that both China and Russia do not want for the United States to have a footprint in their backyard. Afghanistan is sort of the southern belly of Russia and is the western border of China. So I think to that extent, they're not supportive of serious U.S. presence, be it military or ultimately economic, diplomatic, in Afghanistan. But they do have counterterrorism worries of their own against different kinds of groups. The Chinese have a restless Uyghur minority that they don't want to be either inspired or supported by the Taliban. I think both the Russians and the Chinese don't want too much Islamic activism in Tajikistan, in Uzbekistan, and the like. How they're going to pursue their counterterrorism objectives may be very different from our approach. They're not talking about over the horizon and the like, but that is an area that there might be a common ground in terms of making sure that terrorism doesn't emanate from Afghanistan and how to fight that.
Mr. Johnson?
I think that's right. They don't want America in Afghanistan, obviously. The issue now is, do they assume that America won't return to Afghanistan even if America is struck from Afghanistan? It's right now, I think it's an open question about how America will respond to anything in the region and what sort of presence we're going to have in the region. So I think that their concerns when it comes to Russia and China, their concerns are obviously very self-interested. They're about their own interests. Dr. Nasser is right that they have counterterrorism concerns flowing out of Afghanistan. We've seen the Taliban has supposedly made some assurances to China that the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is part of al-Qaeda and also fought for the Taliban, won't strike in Xinjiang or actually strike targets inside China. Remains to be seen. Also, as Dr. Nasser said, whether or not they live up to that pledge. But I think in the grand scheme of things, since they do look at this as a grand power competition, I don't think anything that weakens America bothers them too much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Let me also thank Senator King for presiding. Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Jocelyn, can you help me understand something that really puzzles me, especially after what we heard a couple of days ago? Why would the administration draw down our troop presence to 0 by July without evacuating or even attempting to begin the evacuation of thousands upon thousands of American citizens, plus all of our embassy personnel that we knew were in the country? By the way, when the Taliban was in the middle of a major offensive that they began in the spring. Why would you do that?
Well, Senator, I wouldn't have done that. As I tweeted and argued at the time all the way back in April, you should start the evacuation then. What the administration is saying, and you hear military officials are saying, is that they had to keep the embassy going. They wanted to keep the embassy going, and so therefore their posture was about protecting the embassy. I just disagree with that. What they're saying is that they needed to keep embassy personnel and civilian personnel there because otherwise the government of Afghanistan might collapse. Well, it collapsed, right? So it's sort of a non-starter of an argument for me. I would have been down to a skeletal staff, and I would have had most of the evacuation. I would not have been evacuating through Kabul at all. The last American, in my mind, in Afghanistan would turn the lights out in Bagram.
Wouldn't you agree that the decision to draw down to 0 by July and to give Bagram away, leaving thousands of Americans in the country and leaving H-Kaya as the only departure point, directly led to those scenes of chaos and disaster, the death of those service members, ultimately leaving behind potentially now thousands of Americans, we now learned. In other words, the crisis that we saw in August was directly precipitated by the fact that we had 0 troops on the ground by July. We had thousands of people left, and we didn't even order an evacuation, I say we, the president, by August 14th. And wouldn't you say those two things are connected?
I think the issue of evacuating through Hakaya was the issue. I mean, I wouldn't have done that. I argued at the time I wouldn't have done that. If you know where that's situated in the city with civilian neighborhoods surrounding it, it's an incredibly difficult place to try and organize all this. I think our service members did an amazing job given what they were asked to do. I'm actually amazed that there was only one terrorist attack got through, because if you just know the threat streams around there, I could have pictured something much worse. This is not the way I would have evacuated. I'm certainly not a military logistical expert, but this is not the way I would have done it.
Well, we know actually now that the military recommended evacuations much earlier. I'm looking here at an article from Politico that was just came out about half an hour ago. State Department Pentagon trained blame over Afghanistan evacuation. The article reports that General Miller, Scott Miller, who was, of course, our commander on the ground in Afghanistan, recommended that the embassy be closed and that evacuations of American citizens begin before the drawdown of troops was complete. He wanted them to begin in the spring. Lloyd Austin has apparently said that the military recommended that evacuations begin much earlier for reasons that are totally unknown. The president did not order an evacuation until August 14th, directly leading to this crisis. Now the State Department, what's interesting is in this article, the State Department says, oh, no, that's not right. The military actually didn't recommend an evacuation earlier. So we have this embarrassing and frankly childish finger-pointing between these different agencies of the government. I just submit to you, we've got to get to the bottom of this. I mean, we have got to figure out what in the world was going on in this administration that they were apparently, and I say they, I mean the President of the United States, was apparently rejecting the advice of military leaders who said, don't take us down to 0 in the country with thousands of Americans stranded there. They warned him that would be a catastrophe. It was a catastrophe. People died because of it. Americans died because of it, because he wouldn't order an evacuation, which his generals advised him to order. And now they're engaged in this finger-pointing battle. Mr. Chairman, my view is this. We need an investigation right now into what happened here with this evacuation and with this drawdown. We need a select committee. We need hearings held in public to get to the bottom of this decision. Now, I agree that we need to look back over 20 years of a failed policy in Afghanistan and a failed 20 years of nation building. I agree with that completely. But what is happening before our eyes here with various officials in this government saying it's your fault, no, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, is outrageous when you have 13 service members who are dead because of decisions that ultimately the President of the United States made. And to see these officials, to see the Secretary of Defense blaming one set of people and the Secretary of State blaming somebody else and going back and forth, it's just outrageous. It's just ridiculous. And frankly, it's embarrassing. We've got to get to the bottom of it. If Congress doesn't, nobody will. Nobody will. The Defense Department, they're not going to. The State Department, the administration's proved they have no interest in actually getting us the facts. They have misled us at every turn. And if it seems like I'm angry about this, it is because I am. The Missourian is dead because of this. Lance Corporal Schmitz, 12 other service members are dead. Hundreds of civilians are dead. Hundreds of Americans, maybe thousands, are still there. And all we have is the administration officials saying, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, no, it's your fault. It's the president's fault, but we need to figure out who in the world advised him, why he made the decisions he made, and I submit to you the time to do that is right now. We need to act post-haste. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the witnesses for being here.
Thank you. Now, let me recognize via WebEx Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so glad to hear my colleague just across the border from Illinois agree that we do need an independent that we do need a look into the long-term decisions as well as the immediate decisions that were made with regards to Afghanistan. Mr. Jocelyn, on a recent podcast, you discussed the need to examine the decisions over the past 20 years that led to the failure in Afghanistan, and you stressed the importance of that accountability. I couldn't agree with you more. You criticized government leaders at multiple echelons and agencies for the outcomes in Afghanistan, and you critiqued presidential decision-making going all the way back to the 1990s, including missed opportunities to decimate al-Qaeda immediately following the 9/11 attacks. Mr. Jocelyn, would you agree that decisions made by the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the White House, members of Congress, and the intelligence community all contributed to the failure we've seen in Afghanistan?
No question, Senator. I heard you on Tuesday when you called for your own commission. I don't know what the status of that is in terms of the bill you introduced to examine over 20 years. I would say that it's probably even more than 20 years of decision-making going back to the 1990s, but I wholeheartedly endorse the effort to understand the long-term ramifications of one bad decision after another. What I suggest going forward is that we always keep clear minds about what the decision is that's in front of our leaders, and they make a clear decision. My number one critique of the war in Afghanistan is that it seems to me like the decision making was not clear at any point in time.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I think that my proposal for an independent commission, I served on the Benghazi committee. That was bipartisan, but highly political. I think we need a clear-eyed look at what happened and all the bad decisions along the way, and all the times that military leaders and commanders on the ground were not listened to. Look at the corruption, all of that, poor practices by DOD, poor practices by state. Given all of these failures, the persistent threat of terrorism, and the blood and treasure expended in this conflict, what is the importance, in your mind, of capturing the hard lessons learned from the war in Afghanistan so that future policymakers and warfighters can avoid a similar fate?
I probably can't answer that in the time that I've got. All I can say is I think Senator King and a few others here has started to get at what I think is the core issue, which is that when America is fighting insurgencies or in a counterinsurgency posture against insurgency warfare, whether it be in Vietnam or Iraq and Afghanistan, these are incredibly difficult, complex fights. My view is that America should not provoke them, should not get involved in an area where we don't need to be. We have to be very careful about getting involved in any kind of counterinsurgency warfare. It's costly. And as you're saying, Senator, America doesn't know what it's doing oftentimes. If you listen to my testimony today, this is what I want anybody to take away from it. The one thing that we should have gotten right was Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and they didn't get it right. This is the most basic part of all this. So to my mind, I think when it comes to, I think unfortunately the jihadis are organized as insurgents. That's their main goal. Senator Manchin quoted me from 2014. That's always been their main posture. Al-Qaeda is an insurgency organization. We just have to be very careful about what resources we devote to fighting it and where.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have to say, an independent commission with leaders who were not in a decision-making position in those 20 years. I think that's an important component of it, to keep it completely nonpartisan so that we can have a hard, clear-eyed look. Because in my opinion, and I don't know if you agree with this, but internal lessons learned, the AARs that everybody conducts, the internal lessons learned exercises conducted by a single agency like DOD, I don't think is sufficient to capture the total scope of the decisions that we need to analyze from the 20-year war in Afghanistan. I think we have to look overall. Yes, we're going to have a look at procurement and contracting, and we're going to look at State Department decisions and DOD decisions. But I think we need an overall look across the whole span. Would you agree with me that just a single internal department within our government look at itself, is that going to be sufficient if it's just DOD looking at the decisions that it's made?
It's absolutely not sufficient. What you're calling for, Senator, is accountability. Accountability has been sorely lacking over the last 20-plus years for poor decisions that were made. I think that we need to start looking at foreign policy and war fighting and all these related issues through metrics of accountability. I've often said, look, if I were ever in a government position and I screw up, I want to be held accountable. I want people to know. I want to admit that I screwed up. And you hear some little inklings of accountability from the generals on Tuesday, but not enough for my purposes. Not enough to actually explain what actually happened here. There are too many examples I can give you of things that went wrong over the last 20 years and for which there was no accountability. So I applaud your cry for some sort of accountability here.
Thank you. And I will submit additional questions for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Duckworth. Let me now recognize Senator Rosen via WebEx.
Thank you, Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, for holding this hearing. Thank you for the witnesses for testifying here today. And I appreciate the opportunity to get answers for the American people about the past 20 years of war in Afghanistan. Mistakes made up in the lead to our withdrawal, of course, and how we can safeguard our national security and enhance stability in our region going forward. And once again, I want to thank the brave men and women in uniform who served our country proudly in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. Far too many of these individuals made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation, and many more carry with them the wounds of battle. All of us on this committee thank our service members and their families for defending our nation and our ideals. But I want to go on to talk about ongoing support to those who are fleeing Afghanistan. As I mentioned in Tuesday's hearing, as the Taliban approached Kabul and eventually took over the city and the country, my team and I worked to help vulnerable individuals evacuate. But given the rapid collapse in Afghanistan and its capital, far too many Americans, SIV holders, potential asylum seekers, and their families were left behind. So, Dr. Nasser, what more could we have done to save U.S. lives in Kabul, and had we better anticipated the so rapid surrender of the Afghan security forces, and more importantly, what can be done at this point to evacuate family members of American citizens, SIV holders, and other Afghan nationals who we believe are in grave danger?
Well, Senator, to your second point, I think we need to use all our leverage around issues of economic support, recognition, et cetera, to make sure that the Taliban do allow those who want to leave and are qualified to leave. We also need to work with countries that are engaged with the Taliban, know them, speak to them, from Qatar, Pakistan, et cetera, to also drive that point home. I think that we raised some of the issues about why the Afghan security forces collapsed are clear to us. I'm sure we need to take greater stock taking of that and also find out why is it that our estimation that the government and the military would hold longer did not come to pass. But I think at a larger level, it goes to our misunderstanding of many of the cultural, political, and economic factors in Afghanistan. And I would say that also the Doha agreement, that the way in which we approached it already demoralized the government and the Afghan security forces, that they understood that the United States is going to leave. And at some point, they basically decided to take their own decisions, and the military began to fracture along tribal and regional lines.
Thank you. And you mentioned neighboring countries, and I want to talk a little bit about leveraging relationships, because it's understood that Afghanistan's borders allow for violent extremist organizations to thrive. It enables the Haqqani smuggling networks and the possible cross-border operations to and from Iran, and the use of Pakistan's federally administered tribal area. Of course, they could use that as a safe haven. So to both Dr. Nasser and Mr. Jocelyn, in the short time I have left, in your opinion, how do our relationships with the border countries affect security and stability in the region? And how do you think we can best leverage these relationships for the safety, again, in the region and our own?
Very shortly, I mean, the country that has the longest border with Afghanistan is Iran, and we obviously are not on talking terms with Iran. So that we have to hope that the Iranians will follow some policies that would be in line with ours. But with Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, China, and Pakistan, we have relations. We can talk. We should talk to them. We should try to align policies, and where we can, we should try to influence them to use their leverage in Afghanistan where they can.
Thank you, Mr. Jocelyn. I only have 30 seconds left. If you'd like to just try to say a few words, and we can ask the rest for the record.
I would just reiterate what I said about Pakistan in particular earlier. If you go back through the history of all this, obviously everybody here has recognized today Pakistan's role in supporting and sponsoring, harboring, facilitating, use your adjective you want or verb you want. I mean, with the Taliban and Haqqanis and helping them win this war. I think that we need a critical reassessment of our relations with Pakistan, the Pakistani state, and there needs to be a reassessment that is clear-eyed about what's happened over the last 20 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be submitting the rest of my questions for the record.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, on Tuesday, we heard testimony that one of the key elements U.S. intelligence assessments missed when overestimating the capability of the Afghan security forces were the human aspects of the forces' viability. Things like local political dynamics, corruption, morale, leadership, and critically, the willingness to fight. Mr. Jocelyn, did you see any evidence of these factors in your own analysis?
Those factors have been long in play. Well, everything you just mentioned has been an ongoing concern for a long time. SIGAR, which we do some work with, the Inspector General, they've documented a lot of these problems in their reports, and we agree with a lot of their language along those lines. All I can say is that what I think happened here, my view, is that the U.S. military, for all of its shortcomings in Afghanistan, what they were doing was providing basically the leadership the Afghans themselves needed and lacked. And that was why you had between 60 and 70,000 Afghans died for their country fighting for our side from 2014 on, because they were willing to fight if they had the right leadership in place. The problem was the no Afghan leaders stood up to take our place once we left.
Was there ever a period of time that we saw some Afghan leadership in their armed forces that we felt, okay, we're on the right track, or was this a problem from 2014 on?
I think if you heard on Tuesday and maybe yesterday too, they were talking about the special forces, the elite commandos of the Afghans, which are only like 5% of the overall Afghan security forces. There was some leadership there. There was capability there. They won some fights. The problem is that elite force didn't represent that 5% can't take care of the 100%. So I think that this has been there have been problems for a long time now. I would just add this one point, and this isn't a defense of the project whatsoever. It was always erratic. If you go back to the history of this, people forget that actually the U.S. did not lead the way in building security forces early on. The Europeans did for the first several years. It wasn't prioritized on the American side, and it was sort of only after the insurgency really got ramped up that the Americans try basically at the last minute to start security forces to start ramping up our own role in this. And we were basically behind the 8 ball already by the time that happened.
Dr. Nasser, would you like to add anything?
I agree. I mean, ultimately, the military has to fight for military commanders and also for political leaders. And while we were there, at least the military command was solid and it bolstered the Afghan forces. But the political leadership was not there. And when that began to melt away, and then when the military leadership indicated that it was leaving, Then all those other issues that you mentioned came to the forefront. The fact that the soldiers had not been paid for a long time, the corruption issues, the local, regional, tribal issues, they all came to the forefront. But I do believe that, given the right leadership, this force was willing to fight. And I would also say it was not as large as often it's made out to be. I mean, the larger numbers often includes police and others. At its core was probably 100,000. So well-trained, militarily well-trained force, but it didn't have the right political leadership, and perhaps culturally it was not as homogeneous as you would like a military to be, to have a clear core identity.
Have we seen anything like this historically? Any other area of the world, any conflict we've been involved in or other countries have?
Well, I would say very, very simply was Iraq, when also the Iraqi military melted away when ISIS attacked Mosul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think any kind of, this is why I brought up the point about counterinsurgency and fighting insurgents. I think America is not very good at this type of warfare. We have problems going back decades now, and we need to be very careful about what types of resources are used to fight them. I'm recognizing that as the nerd who covers the jihadis and knows that they're organized as insurgents, and that's how they pose a threat to us. Just there are all sorts of liabilities baked into this type of war fighting, and there are all sorts of problems that we don't seem very capable of solving.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much for those 35 seconds, Senator. I appreciate it. Gentlemen, let me pose a question. There may be some members who are trying to get back. One of the critical issues here was the timing of the evacuation of American civilians and diplomatic personnel. My sense is that having not included the Afghan government and President Ghani particularly in Doha, in any of the negotiations, et cetera, the one request I believe he made was, at least give me cover, if you will, that we're going to endure, we are going to continue the fight even after the departure on whatever day the departure was. And had we withdrawn the embassy completely, do you think that would have accelerated the deterioration of not only the Afghan military forces, but the government? And Ms. Johnson, start with you.
Senator, what I could say is I understand that argument about keeping personnel in place for cover, as you said. The problem is that the final act was 3.5 months, so they couldn't really deteriorate. I mean, at that point, you're talking about what's faster, a month, 2 months. Basically, the final collapse is really over that final 3.5 month time period. What I would say is, if I think the miscalculation here was they, on the military side and also on the civilian leadership side, they had misjudged how fast the insurgency was going to go. They thought they had more time than they did, and that was baked into their decisions with keeping civilian personnel in Kabul. We didn't have those illusions. We thought it was going fast, and so that's why we wouldn't have done it the way they did it.
And one factor that's been brought up, and it's very difficult to evaluate the significance, is President Ghani's sudden departure from the country. In fact, I've heard that there were, in fact, Afghan forces around Kabul ready to fight, but once it became clear that the president had left, they disappeared quickly. So is that a factor that we could have anticipated or should have anticipated? Or
I think there are a lot of criticisms of President Ghani's tenure that we should elaborate on. I don't buy this one, and the reason is because the war was already lost. Kabul was surrounded. We had all the data on the approaches into Kabul were already Taliban controlled. You had Taliban fighters were already in the city. They were already there. They've had networks there the whole time. So I think the game was already over. Now again, Ghani's leadership leaves a lot to be desired, and I would have criticized him throughout all this. He also, I would say, Senator, in your opening remarks on Tuesday, I heard you talk a lot about the Doha agreement. There's no doubt that undermined his government, and as I argued at the time, it undermined it fatally.
Thank you.
I would
your
add
comments.
that already the Doha agreement had indicated to the Afghans that the Taliban were likely to inherit power They were already sweeping through southern Afghanistan at a rapid clip. Thousands, tens of thousands of Afghans were escaping from where the Taliban had conquered territory and were swarming in the direction of Kabul. So the city already was a powder keg. And I think at any moment, any time, as prepared as we would be, that we would have announced that we are closing the embassy and leaving, a panic would have set in. Because a lot of Afghans don't want to live under the Taliban, regardless of how much preparation you make. And I agree with Mr. Jocelyn that Ghani's departure did not change that dynamic, but to Afghans, it signaled a sort of the last act, that the government is gone. In fact, police and many security elements around the city abandoned their positions. The military stopped fighting, and it contributed to the panic in the city, which then translated into thousands of people swarming in the direction of the airport and trying to get out. So he did contribute in that way, but I think the Afghans were afraid. They wanted to leave, and the minute the United States indicated that he was out, I think we would have had some kind of a panic setting in among the Afghans.
Well, thank you very much. There is movement in the back of the room. Yeah. I will yield 10 seconds to Senator Tuberville, and plus his 5 minutes. Senator
That's about
Tuberville,
all I
recognized.
need. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Morning, gentlemen. Probably getting tired. My lunch was good. I wasn't eating. Just a couple of questions. Since Guantanamo Bay was opened in 2002, the U.S. has detained close to 800, but roughly 730 have been transferred or released. What repercussions do you guys think will we see moving forward, when we've already seen some of the prisoners moving into the Taliban's new government in Afghanistan? Either one of you.
I think the symbolism is very strong, Senator, that in the end, those same people that we cleaned off the battlefield and put in prison, and the force that we went there to remove 20 years later is back in power.
So, I've testified before about the Guantanamo detainees and documenting where they are. Mullah Zakir is now a deputy defense minister. He was at Guantanamo studying insurgency warfare for years. 4 of the 5 ex-Guantanamo detainees who were traded for Bo Bergdahl in 2014 are now ministers in the Taliban's government. All 4 of them were detained, by the way, with al-Qaeda ties and connections, including now the director of intelligence for the Taliban's new regime is Abdul Haq Wasik. He was an al-Qaeda man before 9/11. I have no reason to doubt that he still is. And there are ex-Guantanamo detainees all throughout the Taliban infrastructure.
Thank you. Dr. Nasser, on July 3rd, right after the U.S. withdrew from Bagram, you tweeted, quote, "The U.S. is telling Americans that it is ending forever wars while signaling to Afghans that it's not abandoning Afghanistan. It is hoping that things hold long enough for the last of the troops to have left," end quote. I want to pick up a bit here. By pulling out of Bagram, the U.S. was effectively ending its ability to provide significant support to Afghan military, correct?
Well, Bagram was the most important military base for the U.S. in Afghanistan.
So the signal that President Biden was sending that he wasn't abandoning Afghan and our partners, that was pretty much a dishonest statement, correct?
It was a political. It politically, basically, the United States was saying that it will hold on to supporting the Afghans, but not withholding on to military assets, and was going to abide by the terms of the Doha agreement. Yeah. We were hoping that there would be a government in Afghanistan that would be inclusive.
But at the beginning, it was pretty dishonest. And just one more point on abandoning our partners. There are thousands of Afghans who worked with our troops and saved American lives. Somehow, the Biden administration says it's evacuated almost 124,000 Afghans, yet it got out fewer than half of our actual Afghan partners. Would you call this an abandonment?
Well, we had a deadline to leave. I wouldn't say necessarily it's abandonment, but we had varieties of categories of people who wanted to come out. There were SIVs. There were those who had worked with us. They had family members along with them. And I think at any point in time, getting out hundreds of thousands of people out of the country, finding a place to take them would have been difficult, and,
Yeah.
and especially with the circumstances we left, it created a chaotic situation.
I want to ask you this. This might be a little off the subject, but I was recently, a few weeks ago, in Europe talking to some of our officers handling the Afghans once they were evacuated. Huge problems with the young teenagers. They actually had to get the Taliban leaders to control them. Huge problems with wearing our clothes we gave them. Huge problems with discipline. How in the world are we going to bring in all these people that, number one, they don't like us very much. Number two, they're not going to listen to anybody, and we're going to turn them out on the streets. How is this going to work? I'll start with you, Doctor.
I don't really have any clarity on the process for how it's going to work, so I can't really answer the question. I know that there are various range of issues here in play.
Doctor?
It's difficult. In other words, we have evacuated large numbers of Afghans, not only in the United States but in a lot of other countries. Evacuation is only the first part. Actually settling them, integrating them into different societies where they are, whether it's in the UAE or the United States or Europe, is a whole different task.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding up for me.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Gentlemen, thank you for your excellent testimony. Senator King also wanted me to express his thanks. These are difficult issues, but your insights and your candor are incredibly helpful to this committee. Thank you very much. And with that, I will adjourn the hearing.
Thank you.